After the attacks of September 11th, Ian Johnson began researching the history of Islam in the West. His new book, A Mosque in Munich, tells how a group of ex-Soviet Muslims producing anti-communist propaganda found a place in Europe, helping the Nazis and the CIA at the start of the Cold War. This event from the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. is an hour and 45 minutes.
Good afternoon. I'm Hillel Fratkin of the Hudson Institute. I direct its Center on Islam, Democracy, and the Future of the Muslim World, and co-edit a journal on political Islam or Islamism called Current Trends in Islamist Ideology. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today for our event. Both those of you who are here with us physically and those who are with the C-SPAN audience. It's a special pleasure for me today to welcome our guest, Ian Johnson, an old friend, and especially on the occasion of the publication of this new book, which is a terrific book. Let me hold it up and also read its title, because it has a very dramatic title. A Mosque in Munich, Nazis, the CIA, and the Rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in the West. In a moment, I should say a few things about Ian's work and career. He has been a journalist for 13 years with the Wall Street Journal. He has operated out of both Europe and China, and these days splits his time between them, between Berlin and Beijing. He is, in the course of his distinguished career, he has been the winner of a Pulitzer Prize, and I wouldn't be surprised if he wins another one soon. Right now he will be, these days, he is spending a good deal of his time in Beijing, but with this book he brings us back to Europe and to Germany. In a moment I'm going to ask him to speak about the book itself. After I'll offer some comments, and then we will have time for question and answers. But I did want to say a couple of things general things by way of introduction to the book. First, this book, A Mosque in Munich, is not a journalistic book in the narrow sense of the term. That is to say, a book about only about events of the day, current events. It is actually a work of history. Stretching back into, as its subtitle might suggest, into World War II, and even at one point back to just before World War I, and a very odd location, an Indian reservation in the western part of the United States. So it covers quite a bit of historical time and territory. But it also, of course, has a bearing on today. It is also work of analysis, an analysis of things in the past and an application of them to very, very current issues today, including our disposition towards the Islamic reform movement known as Islamism. And finally, I would like to say it's a wonderful testament to curiosity, and what just normal, healthy, simple curiosity. Ian describes in the beginning of this book, in a way, for him the story began with looking at a map in a London bookstore, which just didn't look right, and being curious about this very odd map, which led him to the subject of this book and to this book itself. So thank you very much, and Ian.
thank you very much for that nice introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon at the Hudson Institute. I want to take you back, and I think this book sort of tries to take you back to a time very much like our own today, when the U.S. is in a global battle against an implacable foe, and the prospects for success are seen as bleak unless we can somehow win the hearts and minds of the Muslim world. We've tried reaching out but have failed, and our president, a man of faith, a churchgoer, isn't a Muslim but has an affinity for Islam. He wants to reach out and is now willing to make allies with a group of Muslim thinkers that his administration knows to be undemocratic and maybe even fascist, but whom he's willing to court to bring victory in the ideological struggle. And so I'm not referring to Barack Obama or George W. Bush, but Dwight D. Eisenhower and 1950s America, when a lot of this book takes place. I guess the bulk of it in the 50s and 60s. I think this is a period that's often overlooked in our discussion of Islam and our dealing with radical Islam. Many of you are familiar with what happened in Afghanistan in the 1980s, arming the Mujahideen, and there was a bit of blowback, of course, when some of the Mujahideen morphed later into Al-Qaeda. This era is 20 to 30 years earlier. It isn't as direct a link to today in terms of links to terrorism, but the discussions, the public policy discussions, are very similar. And the key one being how or whether we should engage with groups that are antithetical to our ideals. I focus on this one mosque for a few reasons. One is its fascinating history, which I think in its own right warrants some sort of closer look. Its history dates back to the years before World War II, and goes through the Cold War and up until the present day. And the other reason that I was interested is again for these public policy issues, and that is how we deal with these groups, how we try to instrumentalize religion and the pros and cons of that. As Hillel mentioned, this all started when I was based in Germany, and I was living there after 9/11, and we were looking, of course, at the immediate terrorism aspect, but there was obviously a much deeper story to be looked at. For example, why 3 of the 4 9/11 pilots had been radicalized in Germany, what had been going on there. And I'd heard a little bit about the Islamic Center of Munich, but its importance was really driven home to me when I click and nothing happens.
Technical.
Maybe I have to like pull that one. Well, anyways, so when I was looking at this map of the world in a London bookstore, and the map of the world like the map of the world colored countries according to their percentage of Muslim population, and that's a fairly standard map that I've seen in many parts of the world. But what really got me was around the rim, around the edge of this map, were famous mosques of the world. And there's the map. There's the countries of the world colored according to their population. And there are the famous mosques of the world. And I thought, it was almost like the Sesame Street, one of these does not belong. And I thought, what is the Islamic Center of Munich doing in this pantheon of world mosques? It's certainly not the most important mosque in Germany, let alone Europe. But as I looked into it more closely, I realized that in the history of political Islam, the Islamic Center of Munich does indeed play a key role. For example, the former head of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Mahdi Akaf, I visited a few years ago, coincidentally also had a map like that on his wall. But he was the head of the Islamic Center of Munich for several years in the 1980s when he was in exile. And the story really begins, for me, in the 1930s with this man, Gerhard von Mende. Gerhard von Mende was a brilliant linguist, and as he was called in Germany then, a Turkologist. I don't think that's an academic discipline in the United States today yet, but with academic specialization, I'm sure it will soon appear. He studied the Turkic peoples primarily in the Soviet Union. And he wrote a book that was very astute that came out in 1933 that predicted that the Soviet Union one day would break up along ethnic lines and that the countries that would be created would probably be unviable on their own. Von Mende probably would have had a bright academic career, except that the Nazis were coming to power and he allied himself with them. In 1940, he was called to serve in this building, which is today the head of the German Society for Foreign Policy, the DGAP, in Berlin. It was the former Ostministerium, the Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories, which was to be the sort of colonial administration for the conquered parts of the Soviet Union that the Germans wanted to take control of. And von Mende was put in charge of the non-Russian people. He was to coordinate policy toward them. What happened in the first few months of the German invasion of the Soviet Union was that the Germans took millions of Red Army prisoners, about 3 million by the end of 1941, and put them in these appalling camps, POW camps, where many died of typhus, etc. The Germans and von Mende quickly realized that a lot of these soldiers did not want to fight for the Soviet Union and could be used as allies. So this was a picture of one person in my book in his Red Army uniform. They were culled out of these camps, the people that wanted to join, and fought for the Germans. This was a patch for one of the units that was set up under the SS, and they fought, not with great distinction. They were not frontline troops. They were mainly used for guarding supply lines and fighting partisans. And after the war, most of them ended up in displaced person camps. Von Mende realized that they probably shouldn't end up in Soviet POW camps or else they'd immediately be eliminated, so he had the units transferred to the Western Front. They ended up, a lot of them, in southern Germany in DP camps, where most of them, I'd say 99% of them, were repatriated under the Yalta Agreement, sent back to the Soviet Union to face their fate. And a number of them, however, by hook or by crook, managed to stay on in Germany after the war. I would say about 1,000 stayed on. And some of them were helped by the Turkish Student Union, which went down from Berlin to the camps and handed out student IDs to many of the soldiers, because a lot of them were from modern-day Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, spoke a Turkic dialect, and could, if they ditched their uniforms and their papers, claim plausibly to be Turkish. So they stayed on in Germany after the war, about 1,000 to 1,500 of them, lived in places like this, DP camps. They were pretty rotten accommodations. This is a propaganda poster, propaganda photo that was taken at that time showing what a great new camp they'd set up, but most of them were not that great. Von Mende resurfaced again after the war as head of his academic career was now, even for post-war West Germany, he was fairly discredited, and set up a freelance intelligence organization called the Research Service Eastern Europe, which was funded by a variety of West German agencies. And he reconnected with these people down in Munich and tried to make use of them as emigres for West German propaganda purposes, to try to send them out to countries around the Middle East to try to counter West Germany's main enemy, which they thought East Germany, and also to make a case that the German border on the Oder-Neisse rivers should be only temporary and that Germany should regain its lost territories, which are now occupied by Poland. So von Mende had certain political goals that he was pursuing. And this is where his operations were headquartered in Düsseldorf after the war. The U.S. had a much broader agenda. The U.S. was, of course, in a global battle against communism. Here's a map that shows some new nations that were created after the war, and of course many of them were hoped for allies by both sides, by both the U.S. and the USSR. And many of them, as you'll recognize, were Muslim countries. So the U.S. had what it considered to be a good argument in this battle, an ideological battle against the Soviet Union. Respected freedom of religion, didn't close down places of worship. The problem was that it didn't have a lot of Muslims at home, American Muslims, that could go abroad and speak credibly to the Muslim world and state the U.S. case. Of course, the only really sizable group at the time was probably the Nation of Islam, which had a very troubled relationship with the U.S. government and probably would be viewed by many Muslims around the world as heretical. So they looked to Munich, where these Muslims were based, and at that time the CIA set up a very large covert propaganda organization called AMCOMLIB, American Committee for Liberation from Bolshevism. Most famously, it ran Radio Free Europe, which broadcast into Eastern Europe, but also Radio Liberty, which broadcast into the Soviet Union and in all the languages of the Soviet Union. So they needed some of these people. They were hired to work for the radio stations, but also a significant number went on covert propaganda missions into the Muslim world to try to counter Soviet influence. Here's a picture of one, a Tatar who had gone through the whole route. He had been fought in the Red Army, German POW camp, recruited by von Mende, ended up in Munich after the war, re-recruited by the CIA, and here he is dressed up to go on the Hajj, which he did here in 1955. The Soviets were sending, meanwhile, their Muslims to Mecca at the time to try to extol the virtues of the Soviet Union, of socialism, and that mosques were being reopened and it wasn't so bad and things were pretty good. So people like this gentleman went to tell the other story. And whether or not it was through his doing or not, but they managed to prevent a meeting between the Soviet Muslims and King Saud at the time. Came back to Munich after the trip to Mecca and held a press conference here at the Bayerische Hof, a sort of restaurant in Munich, which was fancifully decorated with sort of Orientalist Muslim, carpets on the wall. The tablecloths, which you can't see in this black and white photo, but were green, just to give it a
noticeable absence of beer steins.
Yes, no beer, tea. And there are the jaded German and foreign journalists who are listening to this tale of the spontaneous opposition of ex-Soviet Muslims against the Soviets, not realizing that this was actually just a carefully staged PR or propaganda effort. Another field of battle were international conferences. Here are a group of Soviet Muslims at one in Baghdad, I think in 1958. Of course, there were many efforts to organize Islam in conferences and so on, almost as an ersatz caliphate. There were constant efforts from the 1930s onward, and the Soviets tried to influence by sending their delegates, and the U.S. sent its delegates as well. The key guy who played a role in this time was Robert Dreher. Bob Dreher was a supporter of rollback, which is maybe a slightly more aggressive form of not containing communism but pushing it back. He was sent to Munich in the 1950s to ramp up efforts to use the émigrés who were based there, and coordinated a lot of these efforts. Somebody he came across was Sayyid Ramadan. Sayyid Ramadan was the son-in-law of the founder of the Muslim Brothers, Hassan al-Banna. He married his daughter, and in 1954, when Nasser banned the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, he fled to Europe and took up residence in Geneva. And because the question will inevitably be posed afterwards, yes, he is the father of Tariq Ramadan, the more celebrated scholar / publicist who was denied entrance into the United States and recently came for a conference. So Sayyid Ramadan was based in Geneva when the Germans hit upon this idea that they wanted to keep control of these Muslims in Munich, and the cables in the German Foreign Ministry are very explicit that they wanted to build a mosque to keep the favor of the Muslims in Munich. They held an organizational meeting, and Ramadan was invited down, not by the Germans, but by a group of students who were studying there, and very likely, I'm not sure in this particular trip down to Munich, but supported by Dreyer and the CIA. In fact, at that time, shortly afterward, right after that meeting, when the mosque was created, von Mende, this is the German sort of spy master, makes a new entry into his card file, and he writes, he was trying to figure out who is this guy Sayyid Ramadan and why is he down in Munich messing with my mosque project, and he writes, Sayyid Ramadan, 36, head of the Muslim Brotherhood, R drives a Cadillac, a gift from the Saudi government. And so that was his first encounter with Sayyid Ramadan. And yeah, so Ramadan has an earlier encounter with the United States. In fact, it goes back to 1953, and he was invited to a colloquium at Princeton University, and there was a long discussion in the Eisenhower White House about how to make use of this colloquium to try to influence the Muslim world. And I have a short section, just a page of my book that I thought was kind of interesting. There's a lot of cable traffic, CIA analysis of this from that time. I'll just read this briefly to give you a flavor of that time, because I think if you change the time and some of the names, it could probably be a discussion that might have gone on in the Bush or Obama White Houses about similar meetings and efforts. So it all starts in the summer of 1953 when this Princeton University colloquium is being set up, and the people from the USIA, U.S. Information Agency, write a letter to the Eisenhower White House and suggest that Eisenhower meet these Muslim leaders who are in town. At first, it doesn't seem like it's going to happen. Eisenhower is not, his schedule doesn't allow this, and then the deputy director of the USIA, Abbott Washburn, stepped in. He recalled the high priority that Eisenhower gave to religion in his personal life and in geopolitical strategy. The early discussions about using religion more effectively in global politics had already taken place, and Edward Lilly, who was one of Eisenhower's advisors, had just circulated his influential memo, The Religious Factor. Washburn sent a note to Eisenhower's psychological warfare head, C.D. Jackson, who had worked in the loose media empire in World War II, and Washburn told Jackson that the conference was sponsored by the USIA, the State Department's International Information Agency, Princeton, and the Library of Congress. And as he put it in a memo, it's a four-way play. In hope for result is that the Muslims will be impressed with the moral and spiritual strength of America. The White House hesitated, and Washburn made another pitch and said in a memo, these individuals can exert a profound and far-reaching impact upon Muslim thinking. Their long-term influence may well outweigh that of the political leaders of their countries. The White House agreed, and 8 days later, the invitations went out. The meeting was entered into the President's appointment book, 23 September 1953, 11:30 a.m. One of the delegates would be the Honorable Saeed Ramadan, delegate of the Muslim Brothers. And here are some photos from the colloquium. Bottom photo, second from the right, is Saeed Ramadan talking to people at the meeting. And, oops, the inevitable photo op with President Eisenhower in the middle, Saeed Ramadan second from the right. And so they met. One of the problems they had in organizing the meeting is that this conference was supposed to be purely cultural, but people like Ramadan were clearly political in nature. So they had an issue in getting the funds sent out because the State Department claimed that it couldn't pay for this. So they asked Aramco, the oil company, if they would pony up some money and help pay for Ramadan and some of the other people to attend the conference. Aramco did, and then the meetings took place. Afterwards, the CIA wrote an analysis of the meeting and of Saeed Ramadan, and in one analysis said, he was the most difficult element, and "the" is in italics in the original memo. He was the most difficult element at the colloquium, as he was concerned with political pressure. I felt that Ramadan was a political reactionary, a phalangist or fascist type, rather than a religious reactionary, as in the case of the three sheikhs who attended. Ramadan seemed interested in the grouping of individuals for power. He did not display many ideas except for those of the Brotherhood. Ramadan, however, continues to pop up in U.S. diplomatic circles, State Department cables, detail meetings that he has, and the material that I looked at in German, Swiss, and U.S. archives show him playing a key role in the creation of the mosque and in meetings being held across Europe at that time. The mosque is eventually created. These are some photos, not really that good, but it looks like in the northern suburbs of Munich. And Ramadan actually, around this time, loses influence over the mosque. The Muslim Brotherhood around this time began to be influenced a lot more by the Saudis, and they were many people were being financed by the Saudis. Ramadan was an idealist. He used to sometimes sign his letters, or date-line his letters, Islamistan. It's a mythical country that didn't exist, but he didn't want to be under the Saudis' direct control. He ran a magazine in Geneva called Al-Muslimun that the Saudis wanted to run, and he eventually lost influence over the mosque. But it's really at this time that the mosque becomes even more political. It's taken over by a series of other Muslim Brotherhood leaders throughout the 70s and 80s, and is really run a lot of the time out of Switzerland, Lake Lugano, where we have people like Yusuf Nada and Khalid Pimat, who was head of the mosque from 1972 until 2001, when his accounts were frozen, as well as Nada's accounts were frozen as part of the investigation into terrorism. At that time, Himat stepped down as head of the mosque because the mosque couldn't operate. So I thought, I can just briefly say also that the mosque has a pretty direct tie to Islamist ideology and the world Islamist movement. The board of directors of the mosque, especially in the 1980s and 90s, was almost a who's who of political Islam, with people from Jamaat Islamiyah on the board, as well, of course, as Himat, Nada, and others. This is a really bad photo. the person who was considered to be Osama bin Laden's spiritual mentor or Al-Qaeda's financier was arrested around the mosque in 1998 and sent to the United States for trial, where he got a 32-year sentence a couple of years ago. It's the head of the mosque after 9/11. The mosque is sort of at the center of a framework of political Islam in Europe. That's the head of the Islamic Center of Munich on the right, the head of the Federation of Islamic Organizations in Europe, and members of the European Parliament on the left. So it's been able to present itself as the normative face of Islam in Europe, and possibly in this country as well. I think after 9/11, there was a backlash against the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood was considered part of the structure of terrorism that led to the attacks on New York and Washington. And there were these efforts, as I mentioned, to prosecute people, freeze their accounts. I think in some ways this was misguided because there was the efforts to prosecute, for example, these people completely failed in Europe. Nada and Himat were not prosecuted, and I think the government just recently decided to unfreeze their accounts. I think what was probably missed is that rather than being a, say, Hamas-style organization or Al-Qaeda-style organization that directly fosters terrorism, the Brotherhood is more responsible for the ideological mindset that creates an us versus them mentality. And I think that's more the bedrock of terrorism, but is not, say, in an operational sense, responsible for it. And yet, by the start of the Bush administration's second term, there were clear signs that the Brotherhood was being rehabilitated. In 2005, for example, the State Department sponsored a conference in Brussels that brought together people from Muslim Brotherhood groups in the U.S. with those in Europe, and this was again, there was another conference that was held a little bit later. In 2007, the U.S. consulate in Munich actively backed the creation of an Islamic academy that was vociferously opposed by the local state government, which created an interesting political constellation where you had a group of Christian Democrats in Europe arguing against the creation of this academy, and the Bush White House in favor of it. So there was cable traffic by the State Department that I cite in the book, saying that there was a policy, they wanted to create a policy of using American Muslims to reach out to other Muslims, but often the people who were chosen were people who were in groups that are close to the Muslim Brotherhood in this country. And you could see a similar effort that's, I think, just stepped up actually under the Obama administration. During the presidential campaign, you may remember that the team appointed somebody who had been head of the Muslim Student Association, which is often considered very close ideologically to the Brotherhood, and this was either missed completely in the vetting process or perhaps considered to be advantageous, and he resigned only when this information was dug up on an online newsletter and published in a national newspaper. So that's sort of the rough story of the Islamic Center of Munich. I think to me, the fundamental problem that it highlights is that we often have we try to instrumentalize Islam for political purposes. We're constantly looking for a shortcut in dealing with countries around the world, almost like looking for a head man. If we could just get the right guy who can control the Muslims or whatever, then they'll do the trick for us. And the vocabulary, the syntax in the 1950s cables seems similar to the cables and the discussions in 06, 07, and today. So with that, I'm going to stop my presentation and have some comments and then questions from you guys. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ian. And I want to say, first of all, that not that they could, but your remarks do not do justice to the book in the sense that it's a very full and very rich story. And I urge everyone here and with C-SPAN to buy the book and read it. I want to pick out a few things just to stress. Some of them have been mentioned by you. One is this, first of all, it's in a way a little bit more general than the issue of Islam itself, that the notion that there is a religious factor in political events, and it was particularly striking that there is a document, a U.S. government document dating from 1951, 1952 perhaps, composed by an employee of, I don't recall now whether it was the CIA or whether it was the National Security Council, but arguing that the religious factor is an important factor, and that we Americans have a special advantage in deploying that factor, a special understanding of it, because we are presumably because we're a religious country. In the context of the early Cold War, that was seen as the contrast was obviously with the Soviet Union and its hostility to religion and so forth. That this gave us a leg up in the struggle with the Soviet Union, and I presume that this argument embraced more than merely our capacity to sort of connect with Muslims, but probably also Christians as well in Eastern Europe and so forth. But that one particularly salient point of leverage was the Muslims, because primarily for the same reason that the Germans had looked at that as a point of leverage, because of the very large number of Muslims under Soviet rule in Central Asia. And so that seems to have been a view taken very, very early on, and I was struck especially by the fact that President Eisenhower had special sympathy for this view, and in fact stated it in his own words from time to time. Obviously, the situation has changed quite dramatically since the early 50s. Our principal adversary is not the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist anymore, but and is now complicated by the fact that some portion of our adversaries are Muslim. But there is this, as you say, a kind of sense or a continuity that we are in a better position to understand this and deploy it, that understanding to our advantage, and perhaps even to the advantage of Muslims because of the situation. And I would one thing I would ask you to, and that the second thing that is connected with this is the notion that we should then really have religious allies within the Muslim world, and that the most, and especially within the politically active Muslim world, and that seems to land you on the square of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's a further point of continuity from this early period, and it is. I think it's obviously there's not a straight line, and lots of things have happened in between, but there is something perhaps about that you suggest as a kind of American approach to things, and I might invite you to say a few more things about that, especially as you've spent so much time in Europe, and how it would be looked at, how the comparison between the European approaches. The other thing I want to stress about the book, because it couldn't emerge from the remarks that you make there, is that the story of this mosque is really a quite it's fascinating in a way, because it's a reflection of so many different things that happened involving World War II, the early Cold War, and so forth, but that it was extraordinarily significant in its own right, and precisely from the point of view of Europe, not so much the United States, because it did turn out to be the first major establishment, concrete institutional establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood in Europe. And as you go on to say in the book, that the Brotherhood has in the meantime really flourished in Europe, establishing all sorts of other organizations, the Fatwa Council, the Union of European Islamic Organizations, various other branches, and so forth. But that actually its first great triumph, so to speak, was not really the establishment of this mosque, but in a way its capture from the people who originally set out to build it, which was actually a group of down-and-out ex-Soviet Turkic-speaking soldiers who tossed up in Munich and had for a while, the protection of the new West German government. Those people got this thing going, and but at the end of the story was that this mosque wound up as an institution of the Brotherhood. And there too, it's very interesting because, again, one of the arguments that led in that direction was the notion that, well, these ordinary Muslims were really just not very interesting. They were not, it would be nice enough for them to have a mosque, but if, from the point of view of the other political players, they didn't count. What really counted was something like the Brotherhood or other institutions connected with it. Eventually, the Pakistani, its Pakistani analog, the Jamiat-e-Islami. And that too maybe is a kind of that too, as I think you observe, is really very much very unfortunate, because it bespeaks an attitude that says, again, as you say, we have to find some interlocutor that will just handle this for us, rather than caring particularly about the general Muslim population, which may or may not want to be handled in this way. I do want to say that I think you're quite correct in saying that this issue did come to be revived, obviously, in the Bush administration, and maybe especially the second Bush administration, and continues down to the present. So it is a very live issue. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that or not, or wait for some other questions.
No, I just wanted to say very briefly, when you asked about the discussions on this in the Eisenhower era, there were a lot of really kind of funny discussions at the time. Eisenhower in one meeting said, can't we use the word jihad somehow to counter the Soviets? And one of his advisors said, I think the only way they'll want to use jihad is against Israel. so we should probably not use that term right now. And in another one, this is I think it was in 1952 or so, there were problems with the pilgrimage. There were many pilgrims who were stranded on their way to Mecca, and somebody sent a memo and said, well, we've just had this great success of the Berlin airlift, why don't we just send in a whole bunch of airplanes and we'll airlift people to Mecca? And then this was also just shot down quickly, like, no, more infidels in the holy places, that's not going to work, so let's put that one aside. But there's a lot of this interesting...
That was very prescient, since that's what had a great deal to do with 9/11.
Yeah, with Al-Qaeda, yeah. So it was interesting because this is really an early phase when the U.S. is feeling out this policy, and I think there's a lot of continuity with policy toward other countries. You said, was it just Islam, or did it include Christianity? And it did. It also included Buddhism, because I thought Buddhism would be useful in Southeast Asia with the problems brewing in Vietnam. So there was a wide-ranging discussion at that time.
There was a great call also.
Yeah, it really worked well, but yeah. Anyways, I don't know, you want to open?
Okay, yes. This gentleman here, could you please state your name and affiliation and use the microphone, because we'll...
Hi, I'm Joel Sprayrigan. I'm a lawyer from Chicago, but I'm vice president of GINSA in the city. Two questions. What can you tell us about what led to the radicalization which produced the 9/11 bombers who came from this mosque? And what can you tell us more generally about the radicalization of ethnic Turks from the country of Turkey, who obviously are a very large and important population within Germany?
Well, the radicalization, I think, has many reasons. The one that I think has the most to do with the Brotherhood is especially up until 9/11 and the years after, there were many, these mosques were selling all the classic works of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sayyid Ramadan, Kutub. These books were on sale for any young person to buy, and there would be book fairs, and the book fairs would have all of these classic works. And I don't know now, but when I went to the Federation of Islamic Organizations in Europe, at their headquarters north of the city of Leicester in Britain, they had this amazing bookstore which had sort of every work of political Islam translated into English, French, and other languages. And I think when this stuff is on sale at mosques, it tells young Muslims this is okay, right? It's on sale. There's no problems with it, and I think that this contributes to the radicalization. Of course, when you actually get to the level of terrorism, then you're a step or two beyond that. But the first step, I think, is reading a lot of these works. In terms of the Turkish immigration to Germany, there's an interesting moment in the mosque's history in the 1970s when a group of pious Turks want to join the mosque. And the mainly Arab people who are running the mosque say, well, we can't let the Turks in because, this is going to be really terrible. This has to be basically an Arab mosque. And also, we want to keep it a small group
a real mosque.
A real mosque that would have normal people from the community in there. So it was almost, and they said, we want to keep the group of people on the board and coming here small. So it was almost like the mosque itself was a cell of some sort. It wasn't a normal mosque. It is now a normal mosque. There are many people who go there to pray, casually, taxi drivers if they happen to be driving past it or whatever. But at the time, it was being run like some kind of a small political grouping, which is exactly what it was.
If I may add on this last point, that one of the things I remember from the book, which is really quite striking, is the initial struggle actually seems to have been between Arabs and South Asians, so that the Arabs who initially controlled the mosque kept trying to keep the South Asians, principally Pakistanis, out of the management of the mosque. This, despite the fact that the South Asians weren't necessarily less radical than they were. Some of them were equally radical. It was just simply that there was an Arab presumption that really the most authentic Islam was Arab Islam, and the most authentic rulers of this new operation were the Arab rulers. That eventually, I think that got
Eventually, they left them in. Yeah.
Which comes to, I suppose, also the other point, various other kinds of ideas that people have had about, dividing, other divisions between various ethnicities, which are important. And I suppose this has come up in Germany, where you have a very large Turkish population, but also now a North African population in the north.
Yeah, and I think the fact that the mosque began to let in other groups of Islamists reflects a broader change in Western Islam, where the ethnic divisions are less and less important. So you see young Muslims in European countries defining themselves less by their ethnicity than by their religious affiliation.
Yes, Dr. Shulsky.
Abe Shulsky from Hudson. I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about the CIA connection from the 50s. I mean, how long did this continue? Did it continue past the Eisenhower administration? And is there much evidence of what it actually achieved, if anything? I mean, is there more evidence of actual attempts at running agents back into the Soviet Union? I mean, did they have any effect when they got there?
Yeah.
Say that.
The CIA involvement, I would say, probably ended. It ended shortly after Dreher was sent back well, he wasn't sent back. And it's, I think, quite symbolic. He was sent to Vietnam. He was sent to Saigon to run covert propaganda there. So I think this is around 1963, and U.S. attention was shifting away from Europe and was becoming, of course, all consumed by what was going on in Southeast Asia. And I think that attention really went away from this area for about the next 16 or 17 years until the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union. And in fact, Rand was then commissioned to write a study of some of these experiences, and one was written in 79 or 80. I cite in the book. It's now public. It was classified at the time, but that talks about some of these lessons.
I mean, covering the period from, say, 1950 to the early 60s?
Focusing mostly on the German experience using Muslims in World War II.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yes. I'll get you next.
Doug Fife from the Hudson Institute. There is a school of thought that says that we should be, the United States government, for example, should be cultivating relations with the Muslim Brotherhood as a way of countering the violent Islamist extremists. Could you comment on that as a strategy?
Yeah, I think a lot of it also depends on how you define the Muslim Brotherhood. If I were if I were in the political department of the embassy of the U.S. Embassy in Egypt, in Cairo, a political officer, I would of course want to have contacts with the Muslim Brotherhood because the Muslim Brotherhood is an important player in Egypt. Then you get the broader ideological universe of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is not just a narrow political party in this country or that country, but the whole range of ideas and people who are affiliated with the Brotherhood in that sense. I think the only problem is that on the one hand, and I guess to directly answer your question, I'd say the U.S. government should be talking with a whole range of people, and we shouldn't say that some people are taboo. But if we are complaining on the one hand about Islam being politicized, and then always dealing with the most political groups involved in Islam, then we can't be surprised, I think, that Islam remains intensely politicized. When we're always treating it as a political tool, then it's natural that it will be highly politicized. So I think there's something of a sort of non sequitur in our thinking on that.
One of the things that it's a very important issue that you raised, Doug. One of the things that is described in the book, it's also been described by others as well, is the European experience. And I mean, in a way, the Munich Mosque is the start of that, or an aspect of that. How that. Although in that case it was we who sort of gave our blessing, a greater blessing, so to speak, to the Brotherhood than did the Germans who were monkeying around in this business at the time. But what Ian also goes on to describe is the degree to the ways in which in certain other European countries subsequently a certain blessing has been given to the Brotherhood as the main interlocutor within their own Muslim communities, and some of the perverse consequences of that, which are that there come times when this or that country wishes it had some alternative interlocutor within the Muslim community, and it can't find one because the Brotherhood has proven to be problematic. The most one of the striking cases is clearly the United Kingdom, but also France, and that there aren't likely interlocutors at that time because the governments have given the blessing to the Brotherhood and have conveyed to the Muslim population that these are the people that they have to talk to, even though there is considerable dissatisfaction with that representation. I mean, this was sort of the way it worked out in France, and sort of the way it worked out in Great Britain, and now, at least in Great Britain, their base, it's Markfield, is that?
Yeah, just outside of Leicester.
Outside of Leicester, has turned out to be a huge problem for the British government, because it involves large grounds, which among other things we use for training, if I recall correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think sometimes just to expand upon that, one of the questions I have is there's always a desire to have an interlocutor in the Muslim community, and I sometimes wonder why. And when you ask people in France, well, what do you want to talk about? What do you want to talk to Muslims about? And they're saying, well, we have to define something like, what's halal meat? And I'm like, okay, so you need to have the Muslim Brotherhood tell you what's halal? I mean, there's sometimes very concrete issues that you can solve like that, how to define certain products. And there was actually a real issue in France about butcheries claiming they were selling halal meat. They weren't, and so on. And for people who want to go
We've had that kind of fraud here, too.
Right. But then you get to other issues, well, unemployment and stuff like that. And, well, is the best way to solve unemployment to be reaching out to groups with a political agenda like that? I'm not entirely sure. Those are often things that are more economic or social, or people living in these giant housing projects that aren't specifically related to Islam. And there were a number of people in France who, they would say, if the issue is racism, then there are groups that combat racism, but also racism against Africans and other groups like that. And then you have a more inclusive thing. You don't just have it all always split out along religious lines. So I don't mean that there shouldn't be any contacts with religious groups at all. Of course not. They're players in civil society. But sometimes I think we exaggerate it and almost buy into the Islamist idea that everything in Islam is political and there's no separation. It cannot be separated. And that's what the Islamists are telling us all the time. It's almost like we've taken over this entire discourse.
There was a question back here. Yeah, right there.
Don Rich, instructor of political science and economics. I just wanted to follow on to your point there that it's a fantasist vision of things that bin Laden has of the caliphate, because clearly there's an Arabist, a Turkic, and a Persian plus South Asian component to the whole Ummah, so to speak. So that, one, you said that identity in Western Europe is dividing up, like it's transcending that somewhat. In other words, we're Muslims versus Europeans, which can't be good for the United States, because two, to what extent do you think, if you're looking at the CIA playing with Muslims, okay, then to what extent do you think Russia and China do that too?
Okay.
Well, in terms of the identity, I think it is breaking down more for younger Muslims. I think the mosques in many countries were really, in Europe, they really followed the ethnic lines of the immigrants who came. So there were mosques from Bosnia, there were mosques for Turks, there were mosques for Arabs, and so on. Now there's a lot more fluidity, and especially the third generation now in Europe sees that as, I think, less and less important. And are other countries doing this also? Yeah, probably. Russia, China, for sure. Yeah.
That's right. I'll get you next.
I'm Malcolm Lovell of Brookings Institute. I've been advocating for some time that the United States encourage the global economy to launch a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. And if we could get Russia and China and Europe to agree to that, and I'm not sure we could, but I've been advocating. And now, what would the Muslim community think of an effort like that? Would they feel jeopardized by it, or would they support it? What do you think?
I'm not really sure. I don't think. I think what's needed in the Near East is much more than a Marshall Plan. I mean, the Marshall Plan, I think, was countries that were fundamentally industrialized, etc., but they had just been destroyed physically during a war, but they just needed their factories rebuilt. They had all the, they were already modern industrial countries, so it was pretty easy, actually. I think what's needed in the Muslim world is much more complex, so I'm somewhat skeptical that it would work, probably.
Yeah, in some respects, financial resources are there in the form of natural resources, oil, gas, and so forth. That hasn't especially helped the region to develop, because it has not led to an investment in modern industrial development, and where it has, there's really not been the discipline of the market to make it efficient and profitable, and that's really would be, I think, those are really issues of political economy rather than just simply resources. You still want to ask your a question, Bob?
Bob Lakin from the Nixon Center. Hi, Ian. Very interesting presentation. Very interesting history. But there were three points that were made either by you or people in the audience that I hadn't heard before. And maybe my hearing isn't good, but maybe I misunderstood. I heard someone say that the Leicester Institute in Markfield was connected with the Muslim Brotherhood and that they were training the Taliban and jihad there. Never heard that before. Heard that the mosque where the 9/11 hijackers came out of was this mosque that you're talking about. I've been to the Al-Quds Mosque, the little hole in the wall in Hamburg where they went, and as far as I know, it had nothing to do with what you're talking about. The third, a larger question, you talk about a structure of terrorism. How do you, and that the Muslim Brotherhood is responsible? And I can understand your point insofar as the Muslim Brotherhood has had a kind of picture of the world, which, in terms of which is similar to the jihadi picture of the world. But how do you use the word structure? Zawahiri actually wrote his biggest book, the #2 guy in Al-Qaeda. His thickest book is a huge attack on the Muslim Brotherhood. How do you deal, and I always get worried when I hear people using the word structure. It reminds me of my academic days. How do you deal concretely really with the relationship between Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda, given that Al-Qaeda attacks the Muslim Brotherhood all the time, and that Zawahiri wrote a book, his main book attacking it?
Well, in terms of Mark Field has training for people in political Islam, functionaries, officials, but not any training camps. It's a school. Yeah, it's a school. Yeah. So I think they just certainly know. There's no implication at all that there's terrorist training or anything like that going on there. The Al-Quds Mosque is not directly related to the Islamic Center of Munich. I simply said at the beginning that I was interested in this topic overall because 3 of the 4 pilots of the 9/11 attacks had been radicalized in Germany. So I was interested in what was going on there that would lead these people to be radicalized there. And in terms of terrorism and I'm not sure about the word structure or who used it. I think of it more as creating the ideological worldview that facilitates the step to terrorism, dividing the world into us and them including many Muslims who can be considered apostates. So this allows suicide bombers to take life with impunity. I think the early classic works of the Muslim Brotherhood influenced many terrorists and many of the people who were involved in Al-Qaeda. That they subsequently have disputes and attack the Muslim Brotherhood is, for me, a different issue, because it's this book is not about Al-Qaeda and the ideological battles or strains that they have. So.
Let me say a couple of things about this. I'd begin where Ian just left off. I mean, that the issue between the Brotherhood and directly jihadi groups, as you very well know, Bob, is that their complaint is that the Brotherhood gave them a perspective on the world, an object and a goal, and even praised the means to get there, and this doesn't carry through. I mean, it is the Brotherhood longs for and aims for an Islamic State, and that was its original mission. It despises, at least in the formulations of Sayyid Qutb, the situation of Muslims today, and calls upon them to make efforts to overturn those. And the complaint of the jihadist groups, and especially the leaders, almost all of them, at least on the Arab side, are veterans came up through the Brotherhood. That's how that. Yes, sure. Yeah, he was a student. Yeah, he was a student of. He was a student of Sayyid Qutb's brother.
He wasn't in the Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay, so he
He took classes in Saudi Arabia with a guy.
But I think you have to differentiate
no, but the
between
point,
party and
that now you want to. The point is, no. What I'm saying, yes, I would say, and I will insist on it. And you can laugh if you like, but the point was the intellectual influence on these people in the late 60s and early 70s were Muslim Brotherhood emigres. I'm not talking about formal membership in it. Now, that's just, I think, a plain fact. And what is also a plain fact, since you want to engage in this discussion again, it is also a plain fact that the works of Sayyid Qutb are far more important than the works of more moderate Muslim Brotherhood figures, despite what you have to say about it. Third, but the third question, and this is a different question, I mean, since you cite Zawahiri was a Brotherhood man. He.
Maybe we should discuss
So,
this after.
no. But the third thing, the question is this, and this is the question that is really posed by Ian's book, and it's an open question, and that is this: is the notion is that the instrument for dealing with the jihadis is the Brotherhood. That is a perspective. That's an argument that has been made, which says that the way to approach the problem we have with the Muslim community and the radical groups within it is to find an alternative which somehow draws upon the sensibility that inspires jihadism, but isn't jihadism. That, I believe, is an argument. It's not a stupid argument. It's certainly not a stupid argument because you've made it. But the question is, and this is the question posed by Ian's book, is what's the experience of that? That's all. And it's not really material, I think, to the question of whether there is always a direct link between, no one has ever argued, I think sensibly, that there's a direct link between every jihadi of importance and the Muslim Brotherhood. And at all events, there are lots of Muslim Brotherhood brothers who don't go off to training camps. The question is, what is the role? Is it a negative role in the sense that it creates a predisposition to that? Or can it be a positive thing? You've, I think, argued, unless I misunderstood you, that it's a positive thing, that the Brotherhood can play not only a positive role, but an extremely positive role in the attempt to deal with the situation. Yes?
I went no further than saying Brotherhood, and that there was. I mean, let me ask. Let's talk about this analogy. Back before World War II. Before World War I, there was a split between the Second International, the Socialists, and the Communists, the Leninists. The Socialists became the Social Democratic Party. They became a huge ally of us in World War II against the Communists. What is wrong with that analogy vis-a-vis the Muslim Brotherhood? Muslim Brotherhood, like the Socialists, had an ideological affinity. You could say they were like socialists, with Engels and Marx had created the outlook of the communists, like the Muslim Brotherhood.
But so that puts the question, I think, the wrong way. Not what's wrong with that analogy, what's right with it? What is your argument for what's right with that analogy?
What's right with it is that when we have an enemy, we should try to unite everyone we can against that enemy, isolate that enemy. And secondly, what's right with the analogy is that even if some of those people have similar ideas as the socialists and the social democrats in Europe did to the communists, they can work on our side.
Okay, so further, have you noticed the Brotherhood coming to resemble social democrats or trade unionists? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, look what happened in the riots in France. The French police, the French authorities, asked the Muslim Brotherhood the Muslim Brotherhood did a fatwa to try to calm the riots. They were not siding with the radicals. And the fact that they did not calm them, I think, indicates that, contrary to what you guys are saying, the Muslim Brotherhood does not have this huge influence in Europe that you think they do.
Well, that argues for the other side. It seems to me that they're worthless, but not that they're worthwhile.
No, but I would make a distinction between them. In Egypt, where I think they do have a huge influence, they could help us. Anyway, I don't want to.
Yes, over here on the.
Ron Radosh, Adjunct Fellow, Hudson Institute. First on what Bob said, I think the analogy, you have to be careful of historical analogies. I think it's rather flawed. The Social Democrats weren't Leninists, which is a big difference. So that it was very possible to work with them against the communists. But I'll stick clear of the analogy with, well, if they weren't Leninists, that's the real key difference.
They were our Marxists.
But on this question, I want to go now to Saeed Ramadan's son, Tariq Ramadan, and ask you a question if you have any insight into what led the Bush administration, as we know, kept Tariq Ramadan out of the country, refused him entry. The Obama administration came in and let him in, and results he's spoken in Washington. You can see in C-SPAN the New York discussion where some of his academic supporters heralded him. Does that reflect is the Obama administration letting him in, toying with the idea that someone like Tariq Ramadan could be our tool? Are they viewing him as a more moderate Muslim that we can deal with? Is there something behind letting him in rather than keeping him out? I'm curious of what you think lies behind that. This, I don't know if you had a chance to read Paul Berman's much discussed book that was reviewed in yesterday's Times book review. His argument in the flight of the intellectuals, a strong case against Tariq Ramadan, who considers double talk, radical Islamists abroad, pretending to be moderate here. If you have any insights on that.
Well, I don't know the exact discussion inside the Obama administration about whether they view to use him as a tool or try to use him as a tool or try to approach him. Probably this is to be seen as part of one of a series of decisions made to reverse measures taken in the Bush administration. For example, unfreezing the assets of these guys I mentioned earlier, Nada and Himat. Probably some of these decisions were not terribly productive. Keeping Tariq Ramadan out struck me as not really an effective measure. I think Tariq Ramadan is extremely overrated, and I find his books not to be very compelling. I think he's more or less an intellectual lightweight. I think he's almost given more credibility than he deserves. I mean, I've seen him talk on several occasions. He's a really charismatic, good-looking guy. 60% of the people, 70% of the people in the audience always seem to me to be young women who are just, bedazzled by him. And, he sort of says, on the one hand, it's sort of the "we are the world" thing. On the other hand, it's fairly orthodox interpretation of Islam, especially the people who are all around him and the people who he's endorsed in the past. So, he likes to call himself, I'm a scholar from Oxford or something, and, I think he was invited to teach there or something like that. Now he's sort of an Oxford PhD or something. But I don't think he is really a leading intellectual light in the Muslim world that is going to solve many problems. I think he's an interesting creation of the media primarily, and he's a very media-savvy guy. But I wouldn't see him as more than that, more than a phenomena. I think he's certainly interesting. But the best way I think to deal with him, let him in, put him on a podium, and have a debate with him. I think that would be the best thing.
I would agree with what Ian says. I mean, it's always struck me that he's sort of the Mick Jagger of political Islam, Tariq Ramadan. What's involved in the current administration's thinking, it seems to... there was a shift, it seems to me, already in the second Bush administration in this direction, and I think that's it's continuing that. There was, in a way, as Ian puts it rather well in the just describing the dynamics post 9/11, that there was as regards in a way all Muslim groups, there was an initial reaction of fear, insecurity, doubt, and so forth, and then what followed that was the search for, an alternative, and that came to rest, the so-called moderate Muslim, and that the prospect of that came for various reasons to rest on the Muslim Brotherhood, and the debate about that has been joined since that time. I mean, Bob would remember perhaps better than I am, because I'm getting senile, but he and I had this discussion within the administration sometime in 2004 or 5, or later. And some of the personnel that is in this administration was in the prior administration. One of the people who has been very much an advocate for this, for better, whether rightly or wrongly, is a young woman named Farah Pandit, who was with the National Security Council in the Reagan administration, in the Bush administration, and but serves now in the Obama administration. I assume that she's carrying forward those views, and may perhaps have been responsible for an event that Ian notes in his book, where our ambassador in Belgium organized a conference with Belgian Muslims to meet American Muslims, and I believe the representations in both groups were largely drawn from the Muslim Brotherhood. That I think was arranged through both Tom Korologos, who was then the American ambassador to Belgium, and Farah Pandit, who was then handling these things in the State Department. Yes.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. I'm Mike Kraft, a counterterrorism consultant. I have a historic question and a contemporary one. Historic, as I understand you, Mr. Johnson, you mentioned that the Muslim Brotherhood had been encouraging the us against them attitude. Seemed to be a large part of the narrative. Do you have any insights on the historic origins of this? I mean, sometimes you hear even references back to the Crusades. And then a more contemporary one, New York Times had a big story today on an imam from Munich, Shasa, who's been going around apparently preaching a much more moderate approach and trying to counter the jihadists. Do you have any insights or know much about him?
Yeah, I don't know specifically about that article in today's Times. In terms of...
It's not that mosque, it's the Darul Quran Mosque. And I think his name is Imam Shabasha.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Specifically about the Brotherhood, I think it goes back to the 1920s when Hassan al-Banna formed the group as a reaction to partly to British colonial rule in Egypt, and also to the modernity that he saw springing up around him. Egypt was transforming itself dramatically, and he went to the capital and saw all sorts of behavior that he thought was, immoral and wrong. And this was all, I guess, starts the beginning of his writings, which take issue with a lot of these.
Against Islam, which is a little different than complaining about the modernization of the world. The sort of attitude that the West is out to get Muslims, which seems to be a large part of the narrative. I'm just wondering if you have any insights on the historic.
Yeah, I think, well, to me, the main point is not so much for him is not so much that the West is out to get Islam, but that there are true Muslims and then there are believers and non-believers, and the non-believers can include Muslims who aren't following the true path. And I think that's where the world gets divided into two camps.
I mean, there's obviously two parts to this. What's routinely said today is that we are at war with Islam, and the evidence for that is supposed to be our military involvement in parts of the Muslim world. That it's war seems to support one part of that. That it's against Islam is dubious because we have specific reasons for being in Iraq or Afghanistan or some other place. But it's very easy for people to sort of say that on the basis of our military engagements that we've somehow targeted Islam. What lies behind that, obviously, is the relative weakness of the Muslim world, which has been vis-a-vis the Western world, and that weakness began sometime 300-400 years ago and continues down to the present time. Yes, right there, in the back.
Joel Himmelfarb, and I'm with the Investigative Project on Terrorism. And this question is for both of you gentlemen. I wanted to ask you about the Obama administration's approach to all of this, particularly to Muslim Brotherhood groups. Just a couple of examples. You have Valerie Jarrett speaking at an Islamic Society of North America conference. You have ISNA officials heavily involved in White House iftar events. You have Leon Panetta, CIA director, going to Detroit to meet with, among others, CARE officials in an outreach effort. And I wanted to ask both of you, A, how productive do you think these kind of things are, these liaisons with U.S.-based affiliates of the Muslim Brotherhood? That's part one. And part two, how, if at all, does the Bush policy differ, does the Obama policy differ from Bush's second-term policy?
Well, in terms of the outreach, I think, of course, it's fine, as I said earlier, to meet with whatever group we want to meet with. The problem is giving groups legitimacy that don't necessarily deserve it. You mentioned CARE. CARE has a rather troubled history and origins. Now, many groups can change, but I don't find hasn't been any sort of introspection or discussion in that group about its origins and some of the personalities involved with it. So I would be skeptical about essentially empowering groups like this by meeting them. And then, of course, these groups use these meetings. The photo op ends up on the web page, and it has the imprimatur, the seal of good housekeeping by the U.S. government. So people in the community then say, well, if the CIA director or whoever's meeting this, it must be okay then. It can't be that bad. So I think that's the problem. Of course, if groups make a good faith effort to change and come clean about their past and history and make an honest break, then I would have no problems in dealing with those kind of groups.
Yeah, as often as not, I rely on information that's developed by your own organizations. So you're asking in a way for an assessment of what the impact of this is at the present time. Whether, as I said before, I think there was a kind of a continuity from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, although it's worked out in somewhat different ways. It seems to me that early on in the Bush administration there was a very great inclination on the part of the FBI to work with CARE, with ISNA, and so forth, and it's actually under this administration that the FBI seems to have gotten rather skeptical about that and broken off ties. I think it has something to do with with the evidence developed in the Holy Land trial. But not only that, further, I would say that there's probably the question that would have to be raised by any, within a government agency, at least should be raised. There are plenty of people in this room who can tell me these questions don't get raised, but in government. But the question is, what have these contacts produced? Of what real uses? It seems to me CARE has had a rocky period, partially because it has spent a lot of time with its ostensible key issue, which is Islamophobia, and the claim that somehow this is a widespread phenomenon in the country and a great menace to Muslims, and a great problem also for the United States. And it seems to me that the problem, they've been beating that horse a very long time, and the problem, it seems to me, is that it's not credible. It's not even credible if you look at their own reports. Their last report was out, seems to me, last summer. If you look at what they claim is this sort of menace to Muslims in the country, it doesn't. They can report that there have been some ugly incidents and so forth, but the specter of what people used to have said, mass internments and so on and so forth, murders of Muslims. I'm not sure that there's been a Muslim murdered in this country since 9/11 for being a Muslim. No doubt there have been Muslims murdered. Or serious arson and so forth. That it seems to me part of the problem that organization in particular has is that it's been claiming that something exists that there's not evidence for in the sources which are evident to people on TV and so forth. There's no reign of terror in this country against Muslims, and so that I think is their problem. The other thing I think is with some of these other organizations that it's not clear, and it may even be becoming clear to government agencies that it's not clear who they really represent, including ISNA. And recently I had a discussion with some people who were Muslim brothers. Who themselves think that that the movement within this country is weakening because it doesn't really speak to the situation of Muslims in this country. For the following reason. I mean, this analysis, it seems to me, is interesting. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. That originally the Muslim population in this country, came here, imagining that they were going back. They came mostly as students and stayed on. Now it's dawned on people that they're not going back to their countries, and that of origin or of the second generation. And that the various things that they've heard through the Muslim Student Associations, the Muslim Brother, ISNA, and so forth, don't have any powerful purchase on what life is like here or is going to be for them if the Muslim community becomes a settled one. So, and maybe that is in fact happening, and in which case probably even. Perhaps some of our government agencies sort of feel it. They feel that somehow this is not. There's not real power there, and it's not worth their time and effort. They're not getting anything from it.
Yeah, I was just going to say about CARE briefly. It struck me it's not coincidental that right after the attempted Times Square bombing, they rushed up to Connecticut, immediately announced that the guy who'd been arrested hadn't attended any of the local mosques, and held a press conference and said, warned against Islamophobia. And that seemed like sort of par for the course, and a pretty cynical effort on their side to cash in on this event.
My name is Peter Probst, formerly with the U.S. government. First of all, on your comment about CARE, after 9/11, they, on their site and so forth, extremely sympathetic, supportive of the victims of this act of terror. However, on their website, they were counseling their membership not to talk to the FBI unless there was a lawyer present. CARE, as I think many people in the room are aware of, is an outgrowth of the IAP, Islamic Association of Palestine, which it was a Hamas front. And there was a break where they decided rather than sticking to things Palestinian, it would become the, I guess, paramount civil rights leader for Muslim America. CARE is an unindicted co-conspirator, as is ISNA, as is MSA, and half a dozen other American Muslim organizations, unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land trial. What they are engaged in my opinion, is what we used to call political warfare. And political warfare is a lot more than propaganda. It can involve anything from the most benign good works, which CARE also tries to do, to some very cynical, hard-edged, political, and even, CARE doesn't do this, but even paramilitary operations. What's going on reminds me very much of the United States in the 1930s, with the Comintern and with the CPUSA. Political messaging was a key role of the Communist Party in this country. They formed fronts, labor, teachers, lawyers, the same thing.
Do you have a question?
Yes. Yes, I do. My question is, do you see the Muslim Brotherhood as presenting a similar type challenge to U.S. democracy as did the CPUSA and the Comintern present in the 1920s and 30s?
I don't want to dodge the question, but I think I'll dodge the question because I'm not familiar enough with the history of that era to draw a parallel to today's. To me, the main threat that the Brotherhood has is, again, in just laying the groundwork for radicalization in this country. That's, I guess, how I see the
Yeah. First, just a technical point about CARE. I think it wasn't so much that they decided that they should be about things other than Palestinian issues. It was that they were a front group for Hamas, and when we designated Hamas as a terrorist group, they could no longer be in that racket. They had to find a different racket, and the racket they found was as you say, a Muslim civil rights group. Though obviously the fact of its origins predisposes them to be particularly concerned about Palestinian issues. It seems to me there are many people in this room who know a good deal more about the communist movement. Ron, Bob, Abe, and Doug. So they might want to go out, explore your analogy further. But it seems to me that there's this difference, and it seems to me also that this has some bearing upon the discussion we had before. The principal object of the Brotherhood or other Islamist organizations vis-a-vis a Muslim community in a non-Muslim country is to keep it Muslim, to keep it not integrated within society, and that's been its principal effect in lots of places. To separate it off and to keep it relatively unassimilated in sort of Western or infidel culture. Now, at one level, that's a problem, a different kind of problem, it seems to me, than the issue involving communism in the 30s. It may be a problem, but it's a different one. And the problem really is that especially in a country like the United States, we do expect people, A, to want, and B, to prosper through kind of integrating with the country, and not to form, despite our upholding of cultural diversity and ethnic diversity and religious diversity, that people will cut themselves off from the mainstream and be kind of a foreign body within our society, and that it seems to me would be the real issue, or the most obvious issue, and it has been an obvious issue in the long term in European countries where the Muslim population is larger, older. I mean, has been there longer, and that seems to me to be the issue. Now, from the perspective of the Brotherhood itself and from all the Islamist groups, there's the notion that they will convert the rest of society to Islam, to their perspective, and so forth. As I think that's, I don't know about Europe, but it's decidedly unlikely here. The real issue will be the creation of a permanent, self-ghettoized community. That's it.
What I see is something different. I see that maybe as their least important ambition. I see their prime ambition to expand the influence of the Brotherhood on the American political scene. I've talked.
All right, but, we should see if there's any more questions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think we can. I mean, I take it your point is that they want to have an impact on actual policy in this country, but with respect to what? Foreign affairs, is that it?
I would say foreign and domestic affairs. One of the most interesting activities that's going on in the country today is in education. And I'm not talking about penetration of faculties at university level. I'm talking about textbooks. Textbooks that are used from elementary school on through high school and, of course, into college. There is a concerted effort to influence the content of those textbooks. There are 4 major publishers in the United States. There are 2 major buyers of textbooks in the United States, the states of Texas and California. There has been an effort to gain control of school boards in those states, because whatever those school boards want in the textbooks often appears, because the publishers realize that those are the biggest markets.
Yes, okay.
Okay, then what happens is the other states really have had no input, are dragged.
But could you? That's true of every group, every interest group in this country. So, what do you see the Muslims or the Muslim Brotherhood doing specifically in this?
In essence, trying to rewrite history, and I think they've been fairly successful. I've talked to staffers on the Hill in terms of current history, and they say that CARE is extremely strong on the Hill. What they told me was, one of the words of one gentleman, was they're crawling all over the Hill, seeking internships for their members, seeking permanent staff positions for their members. This is not a benign organization simply seeking to preserve religious purity for Muslim Americans. This is political Islam carrying on a sophisticated campaign of political warfare.
Okay. What I want to say is, I don't doubt that these groups are seeking the goals that you describe. I certainly don't think CARE is a benign organization, but I guess the issue for the real issue for us in the future is what their ultimate impact will be, and there it seems to me that the question of impact is, you say there's they will try to influence actual domestic policy. So domestic policy means education policy. What seems to me at the moment the biggest problem, the most salient problem, if when speaking about education, is what goes on American college campuses. And that seems to me much more grievous an issue and more pressing one, because you do have the phenomena of wholesale disruption of speeches by radical Muslim organizations, usually the Muslim Student Association. You have radical spokesmen and so forth, and I think that that is actually at the moment the more troubling thing, because our universities don't seem to have any particular handle on how to deal with this. Any final thoughts, Ian? Yeah, I think we're out of time now. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's about it.
Thank you very much.
Wall Street Journal reporter Ian Johnson's previous book, Wild Grass, won the Pulitzer Prize. For more on the author, go to ian-johnson.com.
This weekend on C-SPAN 2's Book TV, Kai Bird on growing up between Arabs and Israelis.